Hello, good evening and welcome. This is Sunday School for Sunday the 24th of January 2021, um, 1 Kings chapter 3. Um, Thank you for those people who sent me kind and encouraging comments this week. I really do like to receive your comments, even if they don't agree. So please keep messaging and emailing me. Um, Incidentally, I'm compiling this only 2 days after the inauguration of the new American president, President Biden. And some of you might like to take the time to compare the first actions of Solomon, as described in last week's reading, chapter 2, settling the old scores that David had asked him to deal with the 17 plus executive orders of President Biden issued to dismantle the many actions of his predecessor. There are obvious parallels and distinctions to draw, and I am not going to point you to them. I'm going to leave you to do that yourself. Moving on to this week, we see Solomon starting out with his agenda. Now, for those of you who are still with me, pause the video and turn your Bible to 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, that was a great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night and said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You've shown great and steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in, and your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered and counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I might discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you will arise after you. I shall give you also what you have not yet asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days." Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I give birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house, and this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid it at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, No, the dead child is yours, the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. The king said, The one says, This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. The other says, No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, Bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in two, give half to one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king answered and said, Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Let's start by looking at the second part of this chapter first. This account of Solomon and the two women is quite well known. It's perhaps difficult to understand why this argument between two women would have come to the king's attention. Women were considered property, and two prostitutes were of even lower regard. It is perhaps a testimony to Solomon's compassion and concern for his people that he considered this matter. That the two women were prostitutes is really quite irrelevant to the problem, except possibly to draw attention to the fact there may be unknown paternity issues for the baby. That aside, this was not an uncommon dilemma. Death in childbirth of the mother and or baby was quite common in those days, as it still is in many parts of the third world. We in the West civilized world, so-called civilized, are so used to the benefits of modern medicine that we can forget this. Additionally, without blood or DNA tests, there's no means of determining parentage. Solomon's solution seems quite dangerous, even reckless. And it's only after the matter is resolved that we can see wisdom in what he did. The true parental relationship was proved by love. The true mother would rather have a child live with her than to die with her. She put the child's welfare above her own. Not only did this solution work, but was seen by the people as a wise and fair solution. If you read that last verse, and they, that is all Israel, stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So this is set there as a great example of Solomon's role as a wise judge. But now, let us turn to the first part of the chapter, which has far more for us to consider. So, back to the beginning. In verse 1, Solomon makes a treaty with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and marries his daughter. Now, this is not a love match, and not a marriage made in heaven. It was a marriage to fellow royalty. It was a common political strategy in the ancient world and continues even to this day. It was not only because royalty wanted to marry other royalty, but also because conflict between nations was then avoided because of the sake of family ties. Go down a little rabbit trail. If you study the lineage of Cyrus, the Medo-Persian king, you'll find that his mother was a Mede and his father a Persian, so cementing the empires together. Darius the Mede, the leader of the army that conquered Babylon, may well have been related to Cyrus, and there is a suggestion that he was married either to Cyrus's sister or his daughter. That explains why he was the military leader at the siege of Babylon. Cyrus's first wife was also a Mede. But back to Solomon and his Egyptian bride. This was not Solomon's first marriage. 1 Kings 14:21 tells us that his son Rehoboam came to the throne when Rehoboam was 41 years old, and 1 Kings 11:42 tells us that Solomon reigned for 40 years. Simple arithmetic tells us that Rehoboam was born to his mother, the wife of Solomon, named Naamah the Ammonitess, before he came to the throne and before he married this daughter of Pharaoh. Solomon's multiple marriages, and particularly his marriages to foreign women, would cause great disaster in his life. Later we'll read how pagan women caused him, even Solomon, to sin. Nehemiah, in Nehemiah chapter 13, said, "Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women?" The foreign wives made Solomon more than a bad example. They ruined his spiritual life. But it appears that King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these women in love, or maybe just lust. In 1 Kings 11 we could learn that he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. When Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. These marriages made political sense, but not spiritual sense. Given that women, even princesses, were seen as property, this arranged marriage was a confirmation of an international treaty. And it was the beginning of Solomon's spiritual downfall. There's an old legend that Jewish rabbis say that on the wedding night, the Egyptian princess cast a spell on Solomon and put a tapestry over their bed that looked like the night sky with stars and constellations on it. The spell was intended to make Solomon sleep, and when he did wake, he looked up and thought the stars were still out and it was still night, so he went back to bed. He slept on past 10 a.m. in the morning, and all Israel was grieved because Solomon kept the keys to the temple under his pillow, and they couldn't have morning sacrifice until he woke up. Finally, his mother Bathsheba roused him from sleep. Now, there's an apparent inconsistency here between Solomon having the keys to the temple under his pillow before the temple had even been built. This perhaps suggests that this is a compilation of several different stories from different sources. Now, although this story is an apocryphalic embellishment, it is an indication of how the people saw Solomon was influenced by his many foreign wives. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, we are warned not to become yoked with unbelievers because of the effect it will have on our relationship with God. This is true in marriage, or in business, or life in general. The old adage, "show me your friends and I'll show you your future," is still true today. It's hard to soar with eagles when you're surrounded by turkeys. Similarly, we should take heed to verse 3. Let's just read that. "Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places." Got to pick this verse apart now. It was okay for them to make sacrifices and worship at the high places, because read on and you'll find that when he went to Gibeon, when he was there to make sacrifices, that the Lord appeared to him in a dream while he was there, this adds some stamp of approval to him being there. However, let's look back at this word, only, in the middle of this verse. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Now, I went and researched this, and because in other translations the word is translated as except. Now, if you use the word except in there, this becomes a different verse. Solomon loved the Lord, walking the statutes of David his father, except that he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. The problem here is that the word rak, and to get the pronunciation right, thinking of it as written R-A-Q, it's a rarely used word. It's actually only used 3 times in the Old Testament and only twice in this way. And it's a word where the meaning is inferred from the context. So with only 2 possible comparisons we can use, it's very difficult to use concept, and the word has several different things it could be translated as. However, if we look at the context, it is apparent that the writer drew distinction between Solomon offering sacrifices in high places and his love for the Lord. The reason for the worship in high places is given in verse 2, as the temple had not yet been built. Now, I, as I am sure many of you, have worshipped God and been parts of organised worship in a range of venues. And it's the purpose of that worship that's important. However, ask yourself, if we would go into a Hindu temple and worship Jesus, because the Hindus would accept you going in there to worship Jesus because they have a wide range of gods. But should we be in a place where other gods are worshipped and considered of equal standing? In many places in both Kings and Chronicles, we can read about the repeated destruction and reinstatement of high places as the Israelites drift in and out of their relationship with God. Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Tyre, married Ahab and was responsible for the introduction of the altars to Baal and Asherah and the violent purging of the prophets of Yahweh. She is probably the extreme example of how non-believing wives can destroy a relationship with God. There's your warning. Be not unequally yoked. Next, then, there is God's remarkable offer to Solomon. God offers Solomon anything he wants. Solomon chooses wisdom or discernment, depending on your translation. And the end of the chapter, the argument over the living son, is presented as an example of God's given wisdom. However, this offer of whatever you want is not unique to Solomon. If you think it's remarkable, just turn to Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Or how about Psalm 37 verse 4? Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. What are the desires of your heart? Of course, if we're truly delighting ourselves in the Lord, the desires of our heart will be much more in line with God's desires. But I remember talking about this verse at a youth group many years ago, and one of the teenagers turned around and said, "That's a blank check for us to cash." My challenge for you this week is, are you ready to collect on God's promises to you? Psalm 37 verse 5 says, "Commit your way to him, and he will do this." Wow. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. However, before you get your shopping list ready, let's deal with the first bit. Seek first the kingdom and his righteousness. Before we finish, I'd just like to remind you of our verse from last week from Proverbs. Proverbs 16:9 says, "The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." Are you ready for the Lord to establish your steps? The whole key to this passage has been seeking God's will. Solomon started off well, but he laid the seeds of his future spiritual destruction. I'm going to read on. Keep praying and listening to God's direction for you. Keep messaging me. Love to hear from you all. Be blessed. I'll see you next week.